You know, usually when we talk about villains in a vast science fiction setting, there is this expectation of simple, monstrous intent, like a classic movie monster.
Right, it is very binary. It's easy to digest.
Yeah, exactly. You see the fangs, you see the dark armor, they roar, and the protagonist points their weapon and says, "There it is. That's the bad guy."
You have the heroes in the light and the villains in the shadows, twirling their mustaches. We like our morality to be visible, neatly categorized, so we know exactly who to root for and who to run from.
But then you step into the text we're looking at today, and that neat little moral compass is completely shattered. We are looking at a narrative landscape that is honestly devastating.
It really is. It challenges all those basic assumptions.
For this deep dive, we are unpacking a source text titled The Sorcerer Kings, Damnation of the Thousand Sons. And we are not looking at generic antagonists here. We are looking at the XV Legion.
The Thousand Sons.
Right. And they are described in our sources not as mere chaos space marines acting out of spite, but as a tragic cabal of psychic scholars. And their absolute downfall, their horrific descent into becoming literal monsters, was paved entirely by good intentions.
It is the absolute definition of a tragic paradox. To really understand this text and to understand the Thousand Sons, we have to explore the devastating consequences of an insatiable pursuit of knowledge.
I mean, it's fascinating, right?
Oh, absolutely. This isn't a story about people waking up one day and choosing to be evil. This is a meticulous, step-by-step documentation of how the brightest minds, the most noble thinkers, can engineer their own eternal hell.
Simply because they believed they were smart enough to control the uncontrollable.
Exactly. They thought they were the exception to the rule.
And if you are fascinated by the psychology of tragic downfalls, there is a massive realization waiting for you in this story. We are talking about a father's love, an impossible cure, and an army of literal ghosts.
It really has everything.
It does. So let's start right at the foundation of this entire tragedy. The origins of the Thousand Sons and their Primarch, Magnus the Red. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, the text makes it very clear right from the start that the Thousand Sons were fundamentally different from their brother legions. In a galaxy consumed by the brutal, unrelenting warfare of the Great Crusade, they stood out.
Because most legions were defined by their martial prowess, right? Like their ferocity or their tactical discipline.
Right. But the XV Legion were scholars first. They hailed from Prospero, a planet defined by its pursuit of intellect, heavily inspired by classical antiquity.
And they were led by Magnus the Red. The text describes him as a being of immense psychic power and insatiable curiosity.
That curiosity is the key.
I want to pause on that word, actually. Insatiable. When you read through the source material describing how they operated, it immediately made me think of a modern rogue tech company.
That's an interesting comparison. How so?
Well, imagine a group of hyper-genius engineers pushing the absolute bleeding-edge boundaries of experimental science, like artificial intelligence or genetic engineering, and they are doing it entirely unregulated.
Blowing past every ethical warning sign.
Exactly, because they genuinely believe their intellect can control the outcomes. They think we are just too smart to fail.
That is a highly accurate comparison. How that scholarly nature, that intellectual hubris, is the very bedrock of their ultimate tragedy is entirely central to the text.
Because initially their goals were noble, right?
Very noble. They didn't want to just conquer the galaxy, They wanted to understand it. They genuinely believed that ignorance was the true enemy of humanity.
So they collected vast libraries, they studied the arcane, they delved into the psychic mysteries of the immaterium, which they called the Great Ocean.
Right. And all with the belief that this knowledge would elevate humanity to a higher state of existence.
They wanted to be the Enlightenment in a dark universe. They viewed the brute force warfare of their brother legions as necessary, perhaps, but ultimately primitive.
They were the philosophers, the thinkers, the visionaries. They believed that through psychic enlightenment, they could solve the galaxy's problems without simply resorting to a mass orbital bombardment.
Or like an attritional trench war.
Precisely. The text details their use of the enumerations. These complex mental exercises designed to divorce the mind from emotion, allowing them to channel the warp with cold, clinical precision.
They really treated magic like a science.
They did. They believed that if you simply applied enough academic rigor to the warp, you could strip it of its danger. They treated the immaterium like a newly discovered branch of physics, waiting to be quantified.
And weaponized for the betterment of mankind. But wait, isn't curiosity supposed to be a virtue?
In most contexts, yes.
We constantly champion the idea of pushing boundaries, of scientific discovery. We laud the pioneers who venture into the unknown. So at what point does insatiable curiosity cross the line into dangerous arrogance?
That is such a good question.
Because it feels like the text is almost indicting them for wanting to learn. I mean, if you have these immense gifts, isn't it your duty to explore them?
That is the central tension of their origin. Curiosity is a virtue, yes, but only when it is tempered by wisdom and an acknowledgement of one's own limitations.
And they lacked that wisdom.
Completely. The Thousand Sons possessed infinite intellect, but arguably very little wisdom regarding the true nature of what they were studying. They were dealing with the warp.
Which is notoriously unstable.
Right. As the text and the wider lore establish, the warp isn't just a neutral energy field. It is a dimension shaped by emotion, chaos, and malevolent sentience.
It pushes back. It's not just a battery you plug into.
Exactly. But because the Thousand Sons had mastered the shallow waters, they assumed they could navigate the crushing depths without a submarine.
Wow, that's a great way to put it.
They mistook early success for absolute mastery. They even started using tutelaries, which are essentially warp familiars.
Wait, really? Like little demon pets?
Basically, yes, but they believed they had bound these entities to their will through sheer intellectual superiority.
They thought they had the cheat codes to the universe.
They really did. And this arrogance wasn't born of malice. It was born of a genuine, deeply held belief that they were the saviors of human knowledge.
But when you believe you are unequivocally right, you stop listening to warnings.
Always. You stop seeing the guardrails. You see anyone who questions you not as a prudent skeptic, but as an ignorant obstructionist standing in the way of progress.
And that intellectual superiority complex doesn't exist in a vacuum. When you have one group of people pulling fire from the ether and reading the future, the people holding traditional weapons are gonna get nervous.
Oh, absolutely. The rest of the military starts to panic.
Which is exactly why the rest of the Imperium began to look at the XV Legion not as enlightened saviors, but as walking time bombs. Which brings us to the next section.
The Council of Nicaea.
Yes, this massive ideological collision.
What's fascinating here is how the Council of Nicaea serves as a breaking point. The source material highlights the growing suspicion among the other legions, specifically naming the Space Wolves and the Death Guard.
Right, because these were legions that relied on physical endurance, martial tradition, and straightforward warfare.
Exactly. You have Mortarion and the Death Guard, who have a deep, traumatic history with psychic overlords on Barbarous. To Mortarion, any use of the warp is inherently tyrannical and corruptive.
He just hates magic on a fundamental level. And then you have Lamon Russ and the Space Wolves.
Lamon Russ is a fascinating counterpoint here. The Space Wolves represent the orthodox, established power, fearing the misunderstood arcane intellect of the Thousand Sons.
But there is a massive layer of hypocrisy involved, isn't there?
Oh, massive. The Space Wolves use their rune priests, who also draw upon the warp.
Oh, this is the part that always drives me crazy when reading this history. The Space Wolves are sitting there at Nicaea, pointing fingers at Magnus, while their own rune priests are literally summoning blizzards.
It's totally hypocritical.
But because the wolves claim their power comes from the quote-unquote world spirit of Fenris, and they use bones and runes instead of complex mathematical grimoires, they think it's completely different.
It is a textbook example of cultural bias masking an underlying fear. The Space Wolves and the Death Guard understand physical, tangible combat. The Thousand Sons are manipulating reality with their minds.
Which is terrifying if you don't understand it.
Right. To the orthodox mind, anything that defies physical laws, cannot be controlled by conventional means, and doesn't fit into their specific cultural framework is inherently untrustworthy.
So the Council of Nicaea wasn't just a polite disagreement, was it?
Not at all. It was a trial. The Emperor of Mankind calls this massive conclave to address the psychic issue, and the outcome is devastating.
The Emperor decrees that the use of psychic powers by the legions is explicitly forbidden. Full stop. The Librarius program is disbanded.
Total ban.
Magnus is furious, but the text notes that he accepts his father's ruling.
But I have a massive problem with the Emperor's logic here. Hold on.
Okay, let's hear it. The Emperor literally engineered Magnus. He built Magnus from the ground up to be a psychic demigod. He gave the Thousand Sons their genetic predisposition for psychic power.
He did. It was by design.
How can he legally outlaw the very thing he programmed into their DNA? What was his actual justification for doing this to his own creation?
Your frustration perfectly mirrors Magnus's. The Emperor's decision at Nicaea is one of the most debated actions in the lore. You have to look at the Emperor's ultimate goal.
Which was what, exactly?
He wasn't just trying to conquer the galaxy, he was trying to starve the Chaos Gods by enforcing the imperial truth, which is a purely secular, rationalist view of the universe.
He wanted to eliminate religion and superstition.
Right. And he knew the warp was incredibly dangerous. He knew about the entities lurking there.
But he didn't tell his sons that.
Exactly. He kept the true nature of chaos a secret, believing that knowledge of the Chaos Gods would only empower them.
That is wild to me.
He thought he could manage the danger by simply outlawing the practice. Furthermore, the Emperor was working in secret on the Webway project, an attempt to sever humanity's reliance on the warp for travel entirely.
Okay, so he had a bigger plan.
He did. He intended for Magnus to eventually sit on the Golden Throne to power this Webway. But until that project was complete, he needed to stop Magnus from poking around in the deep warp.
Because he might accidentally alert the Chaos Gods to his plans.
Exactly.
So instead of sitting Magnus down and saying, "Hey, son, there are literal gods of pure nightmare in the Great Ocean. Please stop swimming there because it threatens our species' survival,"
Right.
he just publicly humiliates him and bans his life's work without context.
It was an attempt to close Pandora's box with an authoritarian decree. He was choosing the safety of the human species over the intellectual freedom of one legion.
But the absolute authoritarian suppression he used was catastrophically flawed.
It really was.
It reminds me of historical attempts to ban certain types of science or literature because the establishment deemed them, quote-unquote, too dangerous for the public mind.
Yes, censorship almost never works the way the censor intends.
You don't solve the danger of a new technology by just making it illegal to talk about. You drive it underground. You make it taboo.
Which only increases the curiosity of the people who are naturally inclined to study it.
Exactly. This brings up the core theme of authoritarian suppression in the text. The Emperor thought a decree could rewrite the nature of Magnus and his sons.
But suppressing a fundamental trait never eliminates it. You cannot legislate away someone's genetics or their deeply ingrained intellectual drive.
So the Thousand Sons didn't stop being psychic.
No, of course not. Magnus retreated to Prospero and continued his scrying in secret. They became secretive, resentful, and utterly isolated.
Imagine the emotional weight of this moment. Let's really put ourselves in the shoes of a Thousand Sons scholar, you know?
It would be heartbreaking.
You were created to be exactly this. It is the tool you have used to bring countless worlds into compliance.
Right.
And your creator, in front of all your siblings, the siblings who mock you, who use their own version of your magic but call it world spirits, tells you that the core of your identity is illegal.
It is a profound rejection. It is a fundamental denial of the self.
Well.
And the Emperor is basically saying, you must amputate this part of your soul.
And that suppression, that isolation, doesn't just disappear. It builds pressure.
Immense pressure.
And when the catastrophic events of the Horus Heresy kick off and the Space Wolves are sent to sanction Prospero, that pressure explodes.
Yeah.
The Thousand Sons are pushed to the absolute brink.
Their beautiful world is burned to ash.
Yeah, and they are forced to flee. But they don't just flee to another planet, they escape into a literal nightmare. They drop into the Eye of Terror.
The text describes their escape to the planet of the sorcerers, Sortiarius, deep within the Eye of Terror.
Here's where it gets really interesting and brutal. To understand the gravity of this, we need to look at what the Eye of Terror actually is mechanistically.
Right, it's not just a place on a map.
It is a massive bleeding wound in the fabric of reality where the physical universe and the chaotic psychic dimension of the warp perfectly overlap.
It is an environment of pure, unfiltered, maddening energy.
It is a completely radioactive environment. But instead of radiation melting their skin, it's raw, chaotic magic melting their very DNA.
And the text reveals that this environment reignites a horrific, dormant affliction within the Legion.
The flesh change. Now, the flesh change wasn't a new problem for them, right? They had dealt with this before Magnus found them.
Yes, the flesh change is a pivotal mechanical concept in their history. The gene seed of the Thousand Sons, the genetic template derived from Magnus that tunes a normal human into a space marine, was inherently unstable.
It carried a catastrophic flaw.
Exactly. This flaw, when combined with their natural psychic potential and the ambient energies of the warp, caused rapid, uncontrollable, and horrific mutations.
It's just spontaneous mutation.
Yeah. Early in the Legion's history, before they reunited with Magnus, the flesh change nearly wiped them out.
And Magnus supposedly cured it, or at least he halted it.
He struck a bargain, a deeply esoteric Faustian bargain, With an entity in the warp that he thought he had outsmarted, he sacrificed his own eye to halt the mutation in his sons.
But stepping into the Eye of Terror, being saturated in the raw stuff of chaos, shattered whatever ward Magnus had placed upon them. The flesh change returned with a vengeance.
And we have to talk about the mechanics of this mutation, because it isn't just growing an extra finger.
No, it's extreme body horror. The very bodies of these proud, brilliant scholars began to warp, twist, and devolve into grotesque, uncontrollable monsters.
Tentacles, extra maws, their armor fusing with their expanding, shifting bone structures.
And look at the psychological devastation here. This is a legion of hyper-intellectual control freaks. They spent their entire lives mastering their minds.
Using the enumerations to maintain perfect emotional and mental equilibrium.
Right. And now their bodies are just rebelling against them in the most chaotic way possible.
The flesh change represents the absolute loss of control. It is the ultimate nightmare for a scholar. The very psychic connection they valued above all else is destroying them.
The connection to the warp that they believed was their greatest tool.
Right. It's now the exact mechanism that is tearing their physical forms apart. It is a deeply cruel irony. Their supreme intellect is utterly useless against their own mutating biology.
The enumerations fail. The logic fails.
Everything they built their identity on crumbles.
I try to imagine being stranded in a hellscape, watching my brilliant peers, people I've debated philosophy with for centuries, literally devolve into writhing masses of flesh.
It'll break the mind.
And knowing deep down that it's the very environment we fled to, the very psychic energy we championed that is causing it, the terror must have been absolute.
Unimaginable terror.
If you as a listener had the power to cast a spell, to try an experimental procedure to save your family, wouldn't you do it no matter the risk?
That is the exact psychological pressure cooker that leads to the central tragedy of this entire text. You are watching your entire civilization succumb to a grotesque, undignified end.
The desperation is absolute.
And it is in this environment of total, suffocating desperation that Ozek Ahriman decides to make a unilateral decision that will doom them all forever.
Let's talk about Ahriman. The text introduces him as the Legion's chief librarian.
A crucial figure.
For context, Ahriman wasn't just a powerful psyker, he was the Magister Templi of the Corvidi cult. His specific psychic discipline was precognition.
He could see the future.
Right. He looked into the threads of fate, saw the inevitable, horrific demise of his entire legion to the flesh change, and simply refused to accept it.
Ahriman's role as a precog is crucial. He sees the doom, and his hubris, that classic thousand-sun arrogance, tells him that he is smart enough to rewrite the prophecy.
He refuses to bow to destiny.
So he gathers a cabal of the most powerful sorcerers left, he accesses the Forbidden Book of Magnus, and he casts a spell, a monumental, reality-altering working known as the Rubric of Ahriman.
The text states that the spell was a cure worse than the disease. I wanted to really dig into the mechanics of what the rubric actually did, because it wasn't just a wave of a wand.
No, it was incredibly complex.
Ahriman was trying to permanently sever the link between the Thousand Sons' physical bodies, the genetic flaw, and the mutagenic power of the warp.
Right, he was trying to lock their biology in a state of permanence. Mechanistically, the Rubric of Ahriman was a spell of unimaginable scale.
It unleashed a storm of magical blue fire across the entire planet of the sorcerers.
This warp fire swept through the Legion. Ahriman's intention was pure. He wanted to halt the mutations and save their brilliant minds, but he failed to account for the sheer, unforgiving nature of the magic he was channeling.
I compare it to a doctor attempting an unauthorized, highly experimental, untested magical gene therapy on an entire population.
That's exactly what it was. And the results were completely bifurcated.
Bifurcated how?
Well, for the most powerful psychers, Ahriman, the other magisters, the elite sorcerers, the spell actually worked as intended, and then some. Yeah, it vastly augmented their psychic powers and permanently shielded them from the flesh change. But for the vast majority of the Legion, the rank and file, it was a catastrophe.
They're the brothers whose psychic gifts were moderate or non-existent.
Exactly. For them, the spell was a nightmare.
The warp fire literally incinerated their physical bodies inside their power armor.
Just turned them to dust.
But because the spell was designed to preserve them, it didn't let them die. It reduced their flesh, bone, and organs to a handful of dry ash and magically bound their eternal waking consciousness to the ceramite plates of their armor.
The text says the rubric turned them into an army of ghosts, bound to their armor for eternity. Their souls were sealed within the very suits they wore. They became the Rubricae.
Let's linger on this sheer body horror and existential dread of being dust in armor. We are talking about immortal beings.
It's a terrifying concept.
When you shoot a Rubric Marine in combat, blood doesn't come out. Just a puff of dry dust pours from the bullet hole.
And if the armor is breached, the spirit dissipates, only to be painfully drawn back into the armor later by a sorcerer.
The psychological toll is almost incomprehensible. You have to remember who these men were. They were scholars.
Right, they love to read, to debate, to feel the pages of a book, to practice calligraphy.
And now they are sensory-deprived echoes, trapped in a walking tank, marching to war for eternity without a voice, without touch, without agency.
And the cruelest part is that this wasn't an act of malice.
Ahriman didn't hate his brothers.
Not at all. He loved them so much that he couldn't bear to lose them. But by trying to aggressively cheat destiny, by believing his intellect was greater than the fundamental laws of the universe, he erased their humanity.
He lobotomized their souls.
The tragedy of Ahriman is that he committed the ultimate act of hubris disguised as salvation. He looked at the natural order, he looked at consequence, and he said, "No, I am exempt."
And Magnus, their father, what was his reaction to this?
Magnus himself was so horrified by what Ahriman had done that he nearly killed him on the spot, before ultimately exiling him from the Legion entirely.
Which begs a huge logistical question.
Oh.
Yeah, if Ahriman is exiled, and the vast majority of your Legion, like 90% of your brothers, are now just silent, dust-filled suits of armor, how does your society even function anymore?
That is a very valid point.
If almost everyone is a hollow ghost who is giving the orders, how do you organize a military force?
Yet, this is where we must examine the radical restructuring of the Thousand Sons. The text details their organization into the 9 cults and the thrall bands.
Okay, let's break that down.
Following the rubric, the Thousand Sons are completely unrecognizable from the scholars of Prospero. The handful of ultra-powerful, hyper-intelligent sorcerers who survived the spell intact became the undisputed masters of the Legion.
They are the Sorcerer Kings mentioned in the title.
Precise.
And the text explicitly states that they became devoted servants to Tzeentch, the chaos god of change, magic, and manipulation. They are now players in what is called the Great Game of Change.
And this introduces a massive paradox. They are the chosen servants of Tzeentch, the literal embodiment of mutation, unpredictability, and shifting realities.
Right.
Yet to manage their army of ghost moraines and to maintain their own sanity, they rely on the most strict hierarchies, obsessive numerology, and incredibly dense arcane doctrines.
The 9 cults. The text outlines this rigid structure. Can we break down what these cults actually do? Because they aren't just military squads, right?
Correct. The 9 cults are a warped echo of the original philosophical fellowships they had on Prospero.
Like magical disciplines.
Exactly. For instance, you have the Cult of Time, who manipulate the temporal flow on the battlefield. You have the Cult of Magic, entirely devoted to pure, destructive sorcerous output.
And the Cult of Mutation, who embrace the very flesh change that Ahriman tried to stop, using it as a weapon to warp their enemies.
And these cults are led by the Rahati, the ruling coven beneath Magnus. And beneath them, the military application of this structure is the Thrall Band.
A Thrall Band is essentially a war band led by a sorcerer, composed of lesser sorcerers and platoons of Rubric Marines.
Right. A Thrall Band perfectly illustrates how they operate mechanically. The sorcerer in charge acts as a telepathic puppet master.
Because the Rubric Marines have no real initiative of their own.
None at all. They stand dormant, sometimes for centuries, until a sorcerer animates them. In battle, the sorcerer has to constantly direct them.
So what happens if the sorcerer gets taken out?
If the sorcerer is killed or loses concentration, the Rubricate will often just stop moving or continue carrying out their last order in a mindless loop until they are destroyed.
It's just so brutal. You have a handful of brilliant, deeply corrupted sorcerers mentally commanding platoons of their lobotomized dust brothers like pieces on a chessboard.
It is incredibly grim.
They were once the most noble scholars, dreaming of a peaceful, enlightened galaxy. Now, their society is this cold, unfeeling hierarchy based entirely on magical prowess.
By obsessively categorizing their magic into these 9 cults, they are desperately trying to impose scholarly order on a reality that they know is inherently chaotic.
It's a coping mechanism.
Exactly. They are clinging to the echoes of their past lives as librarians and researchers, applying academic rigor to demonic sorcery.
When we look at their combat doctrine, as outlined in the text, it perfectly reflects this cold, tragic state of being. The source says they are a predominantly ranged and psychic army.
using devastating firepower and potent sorcery.
Let's talk about what a Thousand Sons Assault actually looks like.
It is a terrifying, methodical spectacle. They don't engage in passionate, blood-soaked melee combat like the World Eaters or the chaotic, disorganized charges of other traitor legions.
They fight with a chilling, detached precision.
The sorcerers stand back, weaving complex, devastating spells, summoning warp fire, tearing open reality, raining down psychic lightning.
While the Rubric Marines, the Dust Ghosts, march forward in perfect, terrifying synchronization.
They are relentless.
They don't flinch, they don't take cover, they don't feel pain. They just march forward, firing relentless, perfectly aimed volleys from their inferno bolters.
Witch fire rounds infused with magical fire that burns through armor and soul alike.
It's cold. It's distant. And the irony is profound.
How so?
Well, they are using the very psychic arts, the very sorcery that got them censured at the Council of Nicaea, to now overwhelm and destroy the galaxy.
Their combat doctrine is a mirror of their damnation. Efficient, magical, and utterly devoid of warmth, humanity, or passion. It is the warfare of the damned.
It's like they're saying, you said our magic was too dangerous, fine, we will show you exactly how dangerous it is.
It's the final corruption of their original intent. They wanted to use knowledge to uplift humanity. Now they use forbidden knowledge to burn it down.
So what does this all mean? If we pull back the lens and look at the overarching themes of the Imperium in the 41st millennium,
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Thousand Sons embody the Imperium's self-destructive pursuit of knowledge. But they also embody the Imperium's self-destructive reliance on fear and orthodoxy.
the text has this incredibly poetic and devastating line. It says, "They are a legion that was damned by its own nobility, destroyed by a father's love for his sons, and cursed by a desperate attempt to cheat fate."
It's a beautiful, tragic summary.
I want us to dive deep into that phrase, destroyed by a father's love for his sons, because that isn't just a metaphor.
No, it can be interpreted on multiple, deeply tragic levels within the lore. First, there is the Emperor.
The ultimate father figure.
Right. He created Magnus. He loved his vision for humanity so much that he tried to force it into existence through secrecy and control, ultimately alienating his most intellectually gifted son.
And then there's Magnus himself, the literal father of the Legion.
Magnus loved his sons. When he saw them dying of the flesh change early in their history, he couldn't bear it. He believed so deeply in their potential, and his pride was so immense that he struck that initial bargain.
That catastrophic bargain with Siege to save them.
He thought he was striking a bargain for their salvation. He was actually taking the first step in selling their souls. His love blinded him to the apocalyptic danger of the entities he was dealing with.
And then we come back to Armin. He wasn't their biological father, but as their chief librarian, he acted as a father figure, a guide, a protector.
His love for his mutating brothers on the planet of the sorcerers was so fierce, so desperate, that he couldn't just hold their hands and let them pass away.
He couldn't accept the natural order of death. He had to play God.
And that is the crux of the horror. It wasn't hate, it wasn't malice, it wasn't a mustache-twirling desire to watch the galaxy burn that created the Thousand Sons as we know them.
It was love.
It was the desperate, clawing, all-consuming need to save the people you care about from an unjust fate.
Armin's love was the catalyst for the rubric. I mean, if he had been a colder, more callous leader like Perturabo or Mortarion, he might have just purged the mutated Marines, cut his losses, and moved on.
But because he loved them, he doomed them to an eternity as dust.
It perfectly illustrates the text's final, chilling conclusion. They fight a war in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium that has already been lost.
They lost the day Ahriman cast that spell. They lost the day Magnus broke the Emperor's wards. Everything since then has just been the chaotic thrashing of a dying animal.
They are the physical embodiment of the phrase, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions."
Completely.
What an unbelievable journey this source text has taken us on today.
It really is a dense, emotional narrative.
We started by looking at brilliant scholars on Prospero, a legion defined by their hunger for enlightenment and their mastery of the great ocean.
We watched the political friction at the Council of Nicaea, where the Imperium chose orthodox terror over understanding, violently suppressing the XV Legion's core identity.
We followed their desperate flight into the Eye of Terror, where the raw immaterium violently interacted with their unstable gene seed, triggering the horrific body horror of the flesh change.
And finally, we witnessed the ultimate tragedy. Isaac Ahriman's desperate, world-breaking spell. A spell cast out of profound love that mechanically severed flesh from soul.
reducing an entire civilization of brilliant thinkers into hollow suits of armor, silently serving the god of change for eternity.
It is a profound narrative. The text tells us that the quest for salvation can be the most damning curse of all. And I think it leaves us with a lingering philosophical question to mull over.
What's that?
It forces you to ask yourself in your own life, when faced with an inevitable, terrible fate, is it braver to fight desperately against the natural order to cheat it, no matter the cost to yourself and others? Or is the ultimate courage found in simply accepting the things you cannot change?
That is a thought that completely recontextualizes how we look at the monsters in our stories.
It really does.
Because sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't the fangs of a beast in the dark or a villain who just wants to watch the world burn. Sometimes the most terrifying thing is looking at a monster and realizing that it is just the echo of a scholar who tried far too hard to save his family. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning everything you read.